This is HOA debrief. Let me set the scene in one breath. Karen screamed that I had 10 seconds to comply before she pressed send. I care what the rule says, I told her, and she did not have it. She held her phone up like a weapon. The tow truck idled behind her, amber light slicing through the drizzle. I stood beside my car in the assigned space I had paid for, rain collecting on my shoulders, my work glove tucked in one hand. It was 5:45 in the morning. Grand Rapids, Michigan. Riverstone Meadows Association. My elderly parent was staying with me, and the stress was making everything harder. I work as a mailroom supervisor at a corporate office, and I hate chaos. Karen was Cynthia Brown, neighborhood watch liaison who treated residents like suspects. She had a portable thermal printer clipped to her belt and a handheld radio in her other hand, calling compliance like it was dispatch. She said, "I do not need your explanation, I need your payment." I asked what payment. She said the fine for backing into my space. I said, "Show me the rule." She said, "I can put you on the agenda and keep you there." That was the first time she said it. I kept my voice low, because my trump card needed perfect timing. I had backed into my space the night before because it was faster in the morning when I am on call for work and I cannot have my vehicle immobilized or towed. Karen had walked past my car around 11 at night. I know because my dash cam caught her stopping, leaning in to check my plate, then pulling out her radio. She called someone. Then she walked away. At 5:30 in the morning, the tow truck rolled up. I heard the diesel engine and looked out the window. The driver was already unloading an orange wheel clamp. I ran outside in my work clothes. Karen was standing beside the truck, pointing at my car. I asked what was happening. She said I violated the parking covenant by backing in. I said, "Where does it say that?" She said, "It is in the rules." I said, "Show me." She pulled out her phone and tapped through a document. She held it up but would not let me touch it. The screen showed a section about guest parking. I said, "That is not about assigned spaces." She said, "All spaces." I said, "Prove it." She said, "The board voted." I said, "When?" She said, "Last month." I said, "I never got notice." She said, "Ignorance is not an excuse." The tow driver walked up and asked if she had the authorization. She handed him a slip from her thermal printer. He looked at it and nodded. I said, "You cannot tow me from my assigned space." Karen said, "Watch me." I said, "I am calling the management company." She said, "Go ahead. They will tell you the same thing." I called the management company. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I left a message. I called again. This time someone picked up. I explained the situation. The rep said, "Hold on." I held. Karen watched me. Arms crossed. The tow driver leaned against his truck. The rep came back and said they would look into it and call me back. I said, "I need an answer now." The rep said they cannot make decisions without the board. I said, "The board is not here, Karen is, and she is trying to tow my car." The rep said they will call me back. The line went dead. I pulled the phone away and looked at the screen. Call dropped. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. Karen said, "Time is up." She nodded at the driver. He walked back to the truck and pulled out a wheel lift hook. I said, "You are making a mistake." Karen said, "I do not need your explanation, I need your payment." I said, "I am not paying for something I did not do." She said, "Then your car gets towed and you pay the tow fee plus storage." I said, "How much?" She said, $450 plus 50 a day. I said, "That is insane." She said, "That is policy." The driver hooked the chain under my front axle. I stepped forward. Karen held up her hand and said, "Do not touch the equipment." I said, "I am not touching anything. I am asking you to stop." She said, "You had your chance." I said, "What chance?" She said, "Last night when I warned you." I said, you did not warn me. She said, I left a notice. I said, where? She pointed at my windshield. There was a small slip of paper under the wiper, soaked through from the drizzle. I pulled it out. The ink was smeared, but I could make out a violation code and a timestamp. The timestamp said 10:58 p.m. I checked my dashcam timestamp. Karen had walked past at 11:02. I said, this says you left it at 10:58, but my camera shows you at 11:02. Karen said, your camera is wrong. I said, no, it is synced to GPS. She said, I do not care. I said, you printed this after you called it in. She said, prove it. I held up my phone. She said, that is not admissible. I said, to who? She said, the board. I am going to back up for a second. Riverstone Meadows Association is a community where the compliance chair carries a clipboard and a stopwatch. The HOA had gone through 3 management companies in 2 years because the board kept firing them for not enforcing hard enough. Cynthia Brown had been neighborhood watch liaison for 6 months. Before that, she was just a resident who filed complaints. The board gave her a title and she turned it into a campaign. She carried that portable thermal printer everywhere. She would walk the neighborhood at dusk and dawn, scanning plates with a handheld scanner, printing violation slips on the spot. No readable text on the slips, just codes and timestamps. Residents called it the receipt patrol. She had pressured neighbors to sign complaints and called it community support. If someone questioned her, she escalated. First, an email blast framing them as the one resident who refuses community standards. Then, an attempt to ban them from amenities entirely as punishment for questioning her. I had moved to Riverstone Meadows 8 months ago because the house was cheap and my parent needed a place to stay while recovering from surgery. I work nights sometimes and my schedule is unpredictable. I need my car ready to go. That is why I backed in. It saves 30 seconds in the morning. Karen decided 30 seconds was worth $450. The tow driver finished hooking the chain. He walked back to the controls. I said, wait. He looked at Karen. She nodded. He started the lift. The front of my car rose 6 inches off the pavement. I said, stop. Karen said, it is done. I said, I am calling the police. She laughed and said, for what? I said, theft. She said, it is not theft, it is enforcement. I said, you do not have authority. She said, the board gave me authority. I said, show me the authorization. She pulled out her phone again and showed me an email. It was from the board president. It said, Cynthia is authorized to coordinate towing for violations. I said, coordinate is not the same as authorize. She said, it is the same thing. I said, no, it means you call the management company and they decide. She said, I am the management company now. I said, that is not how it works. She said, it is how it works here. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of the email, the slip, the clamp, the chain, the lift, and Karen standing beside the truck with her radio. She said, you cannot use those. I said, watch me. A neighbor walked out of the townhouse across the lot. He was watering the lawn and paused mid-spray to stare. I waved at him. He waved back but did not come over. Karen turned and glared at him. He went back inside. She turned back to me and said, you are making this worse. I said, you are making this illegal. She said, call whoever you want. I said, I will. She said, the police will not come for a civil matter. I said, we will see. I dialed. The dispatcher answered. I explained the situation. The dispatcher said, it sounds like a civil issue. I said, they are taking my car without proper authorization. The dispatcher said, do you have proof of ownership? I said, yes. The dispatcher said, do you have proof they do not have authorization? I said, they are claiming an email is enough. The dispatcher said, that is between you and the HOA. I said, so you are not coming. The dispatcher said we can send an officer to document it, but we cannot stop a private tow. I said, fine, send someone. The dispatcher said it will be about an hour. I said an hour. The dispatcher said we have higher priority calls. I hung up. Karen said, told you. I said, I am not done. She said, yes, you are. The driver lowered the lift and locked the wheels. My car was now fully on the flatbed. He started strapping it down. I asked where he was taking it. He gave me a card. It was for a tow yard on the south side of Grand Rapids, about 12 miles away. I said how much to release it. He said, talk to them. I said, I am talking to you. He said, I just drive. Karen said the fee schedule is on their website. I said, I do not have time for this. She said, you should have thought of that before you violated. I said, I did not violate anything. She said, the board says you did. I said, the board is wrong. She said, take it up at the next meeting. I said, when is that? She said, 3 weeks. I said, 3 weeks. She said, first Thursday of the month. I said, I cannot wait 3 weeks. She said, then pay the fine and the tow fee. I said, how much is the fine? She said, $200. I said, for backing in. She said, for non-compliance. I said, non-compliance with what? She said, the rule. I said, what rule? She said, the one I already told you. I said, you did not tell me anything. You showed me a guest parking section. She said, it applies to all spaces. I said, prove it. She said, I can put you on the agenda and keep you there. The tow truck pulled out. I watched my car disappear around the corner. Karen stayed behind. She said, you have 24 hours to pay or the fees start adding up. I said, I am not paying. She said, then your car sits. I said, this is illegal. She said, no, this is enforcement. She turned and walked toward the clubhouse. I stood in the empty parking space. My parent was still asleep inside. I could not tell them the car was gone. I had to fix this before they woke up. I went inside and grabbed my laptop. I pulled up the covenant. I searched for parking. I found the section Karen had shown me. It was about guest parking. It said guests must display a pass. It said nothing about backing in. I searched for assigned spaces. I found a section that said residents may park in their assigned spaces in any lawful manner. Lawful manner. That was the phrase. I took a screenshot. I searched for backing in. Nothing. I searched for reverse parking. Nothing. I pulled up the board meeting minutes. I went back 6 months. No mention of a parking rule change. I went back a year. Nothing. I checked the email archive. I found the email Karen had shown me. It was dated 2 weeks ago. It said Cynthia is authorized to coordinate towing for violations. It did not define violations. It did not mention backing in. I had proof that Karen was enforcing a rule that did not exist. I saved everything to a folder. I made copies. I sent one to my personal email. I sent one to a cloud backup. I checked the time. 6:15. My parent would wake up in an hour. I had to get the car back before then. I called the tow yard. A woman answered. I explained the situation. She said the car is not here yet. I said, when will it arrive? She said, probably an hour. I said, I need to pick it up today. She said, you need to pay the fees first. I said, how much? She said, $450 for the tow, $50 per day storage, and $200 for the HOA fine. I said, the fine is separate. She said the HOA bills through us. I said, that is not legal. She said, take it up with them. I said, I am taking it up with you. She said, we just hold the car. I said, who authorized the tow? She said, the HOA. I said, who specifically? She said, I do not have that information. I said, you need authorization to tow from private property. She said, we have a contract with the association. I said, a contract does not override the law. She said, talk to a lawyer. I hung up. I called a local mediator whose card I had saved from a community event. He answered on the third ring. I explained everything. He said, it sounds like the HOA is overreaching. I said, what can I do? He said, document everything and file a state procedure complaint that forces the HOA to respond. I said, how long does that take? He said, a few weeks. I said, I need my car today. He said, then you need to get a temporary restraining order or pay the fees and fight it later. I said, a restraining order takes time. He said, so does fighting. I said, what is the fastest way? He said, pay, get the car, then file a complaint and demand a refund. I said, will they refund? He said, if you prove they violated the covenant, they have to. I said, how do I prove it? He said, bring the covenant, bring the meeting minutes, bring your payment records. I said, payment records. He said, if you paid your dues and they still towed you, that is evidence of bad faith. I said, I paid everything on time. He said, prove it. I said, I have bank records. He said, bring those too. If you are enjoying this HOA chaos, hit like and subscribe for more wild neighborhood drama and satisfying payback stories. I drove my parents' car to the bank. I pulled up my account and printed 6 months of statements showing every HOA payment cleared on time. Then I drove to the tow yard. It was a fenced lot on the south side of town, surrounded by chain link and razor wire. I parked in the visitor area and walked to the office. The same woman I had talked to on the phone was behind the counter. I said, I am here to get my car. She said, ID and payment. I handed her my license. She typed into the computer. She said the total is $700. I said, you said $450 plus $50 plus $200. She said, there is a processing fee. I said, how much? She said, $50. I said, for what? She said, administrative costs. I said, that is not in the contract. She said, it is in the fine print. I said, show me. She turned the monitor toward me. The screen showed a fee schedule. Processing fee was at the bottom. $50. I said, this is extortion. She said, take it up with the HOA. I said, I am taking it up with you. She said, then your car stays here. I pulled out my credit card. I said, run it. She ran it. She handed me a receipt. I said, where is the car? She pointed at the lot. I walked into the lot. My car was parked near the back. The wheel clamp was still on. I walked back to the office. I said, the clamp is still on. She said, you need the release code. I said, I paid. She said, the code costs extra. I said, how much? She said, $100. I said, you did not mention that. She said, it is part of the immobilization fee. I said, that is not on the receipt. She said, it is a separate charge. I said, run it. She ran it. She handed me a slip of paper with a 6-digit code. I walked back to the car. I punched the code into the clamp. It clicked open. I pulled it off and carried it back to the office. I dropped it on the counter. I said, you are going to hear from me. She said, have a nice day. I drove back to Riverstone Meadows. My parent was awake and sitting in the kitchen. They asked where I had been. I said I had to run an errand. They asked why I took their car. I said mine was in the shop. They said you did not mention that. I said it was last minute. They let it go. I went to my room and pulled out the evidence folder. I had the covenant section proving assigned spaces allowed any lawful manner. I had the meeting minutes showing no rule change. I had the bank statements showing I paid on time. I had the tow yard receipt showing $700 in fees. I had the photos of Karen and the truck. I had the dash cam footage showing the timestamp discrepancy. I needed one more thing. I needed proof that the HOA was marking my payments late when they were not. I logged into the HOA portal. I pulled up my payment history. Every payment showed received, but 3 of them were flagged late. I checked the dates. They were all received 2 days before the due date. I downloaded the report. I had my trump card. A bank confirmation showing my payments cleared and the HOA marked them late anyway. I drafted an email to the management company and the board president. I attached the covenant section, the meeting minutes, the bank statements, the payment history, the tow receipt, the photos, and the dash cam footage. I wrote, I was towed this morning for backing into my assigned space. The covenant allows any lawful manner of parking. No rule change was recorded. I paid $700 in fees that I should not owe. I am also attaching proof that my HOA payments were marked late when they were received on time. I am requesting a full refund of the tow and immobilization fees, a correction of my payment record, and a written apology. I am also requesting that Cynthia Brown's authority to coordinate towing be revoked immediately. If this is not resolved within 48 hours, I will file a state procedure complaint. I hit send. Within an hour, I got a reply. It was from the board president. It said, "We are reviewing your claim." Cynthia acted within her authority. The fees are valid. Your payment history is accurate. If you have concerns, you may attend the next board meeting. I replied, my payment history is not accurate. I have bank records proving it. I also have the covenant proving the rule Cynthia enforced does not exist. I expect a refund and a correction within 48 hours or I will file a complaint. I got no reply. I waited 2 hours. Nothing. I called the management company. The same rep answered. I said I sent an email with evidence. The rep said they are reviewing it. I said I need a timeline. The rep said they cannot give one. I said, why not? The rep said the board has to vote. I said, on what? The rep said on whether to issue a refund. I said there is nothing to vote on. The rule does not exist. The rep said that is the board's determination. I said the covenant is not up for interpretation. The rep said take it up at the meeting. I said the meeting is 3 weeks away. The rep said that is the process. The call dropped again. I called the mediator back. I told him what happened. He said you need to escalate. I said how? He said file the complaint today. I said I thought I should wait. He said they are stalling. If you wait, they will drag this out for months. I said, what do I need? He said the evidence you have is enough. File online. I pulled up the state HOA complaint portal. I filled out the form. I attached everything. I submitted it. The confirmation screen said the HOA would be required to respond within 30 days. I took a screenshot. I emailed the board president and the management company with the complaint number. I said, I filed a state complaint. You have 30 days to respond. I expect a full refund and a correction before then. The next morning, Karen knocked on my door. I opened it. She was holding her thermal printer and her radio. She said, you filed a complaint. I said, yes. She said that was a mistake. I said, no. Towing my car was a mistake. She said, you are going to regret this. I said, I already regret living here. She said, I can make things very difficult for you. I said, you already did. She said, I can put you on the agenda and keep you there. I said, go ahead. She said, you will be banned from the clubhouse, the pool, and the gym. I said, for what? She said, for filing a frivolous complaint. I said, it is not frivolous. I have proof. She said, the board does not care about your proof. I said, the state does. She said, we will see. She turned and walked away. I closed the door. I checked my email. There was a new message from the board president. It said, your complaint has been noted. The board will address it at the next meeting. In the meantime, your access to amenities is suspended pending review. I replied, you cannot suspend my access without cause. I paid my dues. I have not violated any rules. This is retaliation. I got no reply. That night, I was leaving for a late shift at work. I walked out to my car. There was a new violation slip on the windshield. I pulled it off. The timestamp said 8:30 p.m. It was 8:45. I looked around. Karen was standing near the clubhouse entrance, watching me. She had her thermal printer in her hand. I walked over. I said, "What is this for?" She said, "Your car is parked over the line." I said, "No, it is not." She said, "Yes, it is." I walked back and looked. My car was centered in the space. I took a photo. I walked back to Karen. I said, "It is not over the line." She said, "It is close enough." I said, "Close enough is not a violation." She said, "I decide what is a violation." I said, "No, the covenant decides." She said, "The covenant gives me discretion." I said, "Show me where." She said, "I do not have to show you anything." I said, "Yes, you do." She said, "I can put you on the agenda and keep you there." I said, "You already said that." She said, "I mean it." I said, "So do I." She turned and walked into the clubhouse. I got in my car and left. At work, I got a text from the neighbor who had been watering his lawn. He said, "I saw what happened with your car. I have it on my camera if you need it." I replied, "Yes, send it to me." He sent a video file. I opened it on my phone. It showed Karen walking up to my car, leaning in to check the plate, pulling out her radio and making a call. The timestamp matched my dash cam. I saved the file. I replied, "Thank you. This helps." He said, "She has been doing this to a lot of people." I replied, "Do you know anyone else she targeted?" He said, "A few. I can ask if they want to talk." I said, "Please do." The next day, I got emails from 3 other residents. One said Karen had towed their guest for parking in a visitor spot without a pass, even though the guest had a pass on the dashboard. Another said Karen had fined them for leaving a trash can out past 7 a.m., even though the covenant said 8 a.m. The third said Karen had blocked their driveway with cones and called it a fire lane violation, even though their driveway was not near a fire lane. All 3 had filed complaints with the management company. None had gotten refunds. I replied to all of them and said I filed a state complaint and they should too. 2 of them said they would. The third said they were moving out. The following week, I got a notice that the board was holding an emergency meeting. The agenda said, "Discussion of resident complaints and enforcement procedures." I marked my calendar. The meeting was in 2 days. I prepared a packet with all my evidence. I printed the covenant sections, the meeting minutes, the bank statements, the payment history, the tow receipt, the photos, the dash cam footage, and the neighbor's video. I put it all in a tabbed evidence binder. The night before the meeting, Karen walked past my car again. I was sitting in the driver's seat about to leave for work. She stopped and looked at me. She pulled out her thermal printer and printed a slip. She walked up and slapped it on my windshield. I got out. I said, "What is this for?" She said, "Failure to display a current registration sticker." I said, "My registration is current." She said, "The sticker is faded." I said, "Faded is not expired." She said, "It is not clearly visible." I said, "You can read it." She said, "I cannot." I said, "Then you need glasses." She said, "I do not need your explanation, I need your payment." I said, "I am not paying." She said, "Then I will tow it again." I said, "Go ahead." I pulled out my phone and started recording. She said, "You cannot record me." I said, "Yes, I can." She said, "This is harassment." I said, "No, this is documentation." She turned and walked away. I peeled the slip off my windshield and put it in my evidence binder. The next morning I left early for the meeting. I drove to the clubhouse. The parking lot was full. I had to park on the street. I walked in carrying my evidence binder. The board president and 4 other board members were sitting at a table in the front. Karen was sitting in the front row. About 20 residents were scattered around the room. I sat in the 3rd row. The board president called the meeting to order. He said, "We are here to discuss enforcement procedures and recent complaints. Several residents have raised concerns about the towing policy and Cynthia Brown's role. We want to address these concerns tonight." He looked at Karen. He said, "Cynthia, can you explain your process?" Karen stood up. She said, "I follow the covenant. When I see a violation, I document it and coordinate with the tow vendor. The board authorized me to do this." The board president said, "Can you show us the authorization?" Karen pulled out her phone and showed him the email. He read it and nodded. He said, "This says you can coordinate towing for violations. It does not define violations." Karen said, "The covenant defines violations." The board president said, "Which section?" Karen said, "Multiple sections." The board president said, "Can you name them?" Karen paused. She said, "I can provide a list." The board president said, "Do you have it now?" Karen said, "No." The board president said, "Then how do you know what to enforce?" Karen said, "I use my judgment." The board president looked at me. He said, "You filed a complaint. Can you explain your issue?" I stood up. I said, "I was towed for backing into my assigned space. The covenant says residents may park in any lawful manner. There is no rule against backing in." I checked the meeting minutes. No rule change was recorded. I paid $700 in fees that I should not owe. I also have proof that my HOA payments were marked late when they were received on time. I held up the binder. I said, "I have the covenant section, the meeting minutes, the bank statements, the payment history, the tow receipt, the photos, and video evidence." The board president said, "Can we see it?" I walked up and handed him the binder. He opened it and started reading. The other board members leaned in. Karen stood up. She said, "This is a waste of time." The board president said, "Sit down, Cynthia." Karen sat down. The board president kept reading. He looked at the bank statements. He looked at the payment history. He looked at the covenant section. He looked at me. He said, "This shows your payments were received on time. Why were they marked late?" I said, "That is what I want to know." He looked at the management company rep who was sitting in the back. The rep stood up. He said, "I will have to check the records." The board president said, "Check them now." The rep pulled out a laptop and typed. After a minute, he said, "It looks like there was a processing delay." The board president said, "A delay does not make a payment late." The rep said, "I will correct it." The board president said, "You will also refund the late fees." The rep nodded. The board president looked at Karen. He said, "Cynthia, the covenant does not prohibit backing into assigned spaces. Why did you tow his car?" Karen said, "I interpreted the guest parking rule to apply to all spaces." The board president said, "That is not what it says." Karen said, "It is implied." The board president said, "No, it is not." He looked at the other board members. He said, "Do any of you remember voting to prohibit backing in?" They all shook their heads. He looked at Karen. He said, "You enforced a rule that does not exist." Karen said, "I was trying to maintain order." The board president said, "You were exceeding your authority." He looked at me. He said, "I am sorry this happened. We will refund your tow and immobilization fees in full. We will also clear your payment record." I said, "What about Cynthia?" The board president looked at Karen. He said, "Cynthia, your authority to coordinate towing is revoked effective immediately. If you want to report a violation, you will submit it to the management company like everyone else." Karen stood up. She said, "This is ridiculous." The board president said, "Sit down or leave." Karen said, "I quit." She walked out. The room was silent. The board president said, "We will also be reviewing our contract with the tow vendor. If they are charging excessive fees, we will find a new vendor." He looked at me. He said, "Is there anything else?" I said, "Yes. I want a formal apology in writing, and I want it sent to every resident so they know what happened." The board president said, "We can do that." I said, "I also want the management company to explain why my payments were marked late." The management company rep stood up. He said, "As I said, it was a processing delay." I said, "A processing delay does not explain why it happened 3 times in 6 months." The rep said, "I will investigate and provide a report." The board president said, "You will provide it by the end of the week." The rep nodded. The board president said, "This meeting is adjourned." I walked out of the clubhouse. The neighbor who had sent me the video was waiting outside. He said, "That was amazing." I said, "It is not over yet." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I still need the refund and the apology." He said, "You will get them." I said, "We will see." He said, "If you need anything else, let me know." I said, "Thank you." I got in my car and drove home. My parent was sitting in the living room. They asked how it went. I said, "Better than expected." They said, "Good." They did not ask for details. I did not offer them. 2 days later, I got an email from the board president. It included a formal apology and a breakdown of the refund. The total was $800, covering the tow fee, the immobilization fee, the processing fee, the release code fee, the late fees, and interest. The email said a check would be mailed within 10 business days. It also said the management company had completed their investigation and found that the payment delays were caused by a software glitch that has been fixed. I did not believe the glitch explanation, but I did not care. I had my refund and my apology. The email also said that Karen's timeline was proven false with timestamps, and she had resigned from all HOA roles. A new liaison would be appointed at the next meeting. The board president attached a letter that would be sent to all residents explaining what happened and apologizing for the enforcement overreach. I saved everything. The check arrived 9 days later. I deposited it. I pulled up the HOA portal and checked my payment history. All the late flags were gone. I downloaded a new report and saved it. I emailed the mediator and thanked him for his advice. He replied, "Glad it worked out. Let me know if you need anything else." I replied, "I think I am good." A week later, I got a text from one of the other residents who had filed a complaint. She said, "I just got a refund for my guest tow. Thank you for starting this." I replied, "No problem." She said, "A few of us are pushing to replace the board at the next election. Are you interested?" I said, "Maybe." "Let me think about it." She said, "No pressure. Just wanted you to know." I said, "Thanks." That night, I parked in my assigned space. I backed in. No one said anything. I walked to my door and looked around. Karen's townhouse was dark. I heard she had moved out 2 weeks after the meeting. No one knew where she went. The new liaison was a retired teacher who walked the neighborhood with a clipboard but no thermal printer. She introduced herself to everyone and asked what they needed. She said she wanted to rebuild trust. Most people gave her a chance. I did too. A month later, the board fired the management company. They hired an interim manager who froze enforcement until an audit finishes. The audit is supposed to take 3 months. In the meantime, No one is getting towed unless they block a fire lane or park in a handicapped spot without a permit. The neighborhood feels different. People are talking to each other again. The compliance culture is fading. I still keep my evidence binder in my car, just in case. But I have not needed it. My parent is doing better. They are planning to stay another few months. I am still backing into my space every night. No one has said a word. I will bring you another one next time.